So thanks everyone for coming tonight. It's great to have you all here, especially given how busy this week is with affairs and associated programming. I'm Alicia Ritson, the Research Fellow here at the New Museum, and it's with great pleasure to introduce Goshka Macuga and Margot Norton in conversation tonight. We're very lucky to have Goshka with us here from London for the opening week of her exhibition, Time as Fabric. Goshka has had solo exhibitions at the Prada Foundation in Milan in 2016, Lunds Konsthall in Lund, Sweden, 2014, MCA Chicago 2012, and the Walker Art Center 2011, and that's just to name a few. She's also been included in important group shows like the 8th Berlin Biennial 2014, Documenta 13 in Kassel 2012, and Making Worlds, the 2009 Venice Biennale. Time as Fabric is the first exhibition of Goshka's work here in New York, which is both really exciting for us and also strangely hard to fathom. Many of you here are familiar with Goshka's practice, with her detailed research, often archival, into the social histories and cultural histories of the institutions in which her work has been presented. Time as Fabric takes stock of some of these works in response to several significant commissions by the Whitechapel, Zagieta National Gallery of Art in Warsaw, the Walker Art Center, and Documenta 13. An exhibition like this draws attention to the ways Goshka stages the relationships and sets of associations and the way she stages the relationships and sets of associations that she unearths between different actors, whether they be sites or people or objects. It points to how Goshka consistently problematizes the ways different organizations engage their publics and shows the complex connections between performance, display, and demonstration. Tonight's program is a special opportunity to both unpack and delve deeper into Goshka's practice with her here and with Margot as one of the curators of the exhibition. They'll be speaking about the exhibition as well as Goshka's practice at large, and they'll also be showing some of the video documentation of Preparatory Notes, which is a play that Goshka produced in 2014 for the Berlin Biennial. So the conversation itself will go for about roughly 50 minutes along with the video, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. And I'd just like to wrap up tonight by thanking the New Women's Project and founding partner DKNY, who's the major sponsor both of Time as Fabric and all of our current exhibitions here at the New Museum. So I might just ask everyone to put their hands together in a warm welcome for Goshka and also for Margot.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Alicia. So I think, we're gonna get right into it. I think each one of Goshka's projects contains a million stories, and we could probably have a talk about each one of the works presented in the exhibition. That would probably take days. So I just thought we would kind of dive right into the works in the show and kind of talk about them more in depth, as well as touching upon these larger themes within your practice. Just wanted to mention this exhibition, Time as Fabric, which I hope you've all seen on the second floor, and for those of you who haven't, it'll be up through the end of June. It differs from a lot of Goshka's past shows. As Alicia mentioned, her work kind of often involves research into institutions, and the content and format of her projects are often very much tied to the institutions where the work is shown. And for this exhibition, we wanted to have a little different approach. We're bringing together some of her major projects that she's done over the past 5 years. And in doing so, we're hoping, and I feel this strongly, that certain dialogues between the works emerge. The works shown are kind of done over a period of about 5 years, where Goshka started working with the medium of tapestry. Now, working with that specific medium is not something that she's been doing her whole career. The medium is not the first thing that she thinks about when doing her projects, but it's also it's more about the ideas and the concepts behind the work, and then the medium kind of comes after that. But for this period of 5 years, she's been working in this specific medium of tapestry, and the show upstairs contains 5 tapestries, as well as a set for a performance, Preparatory Notes, which we'll kind of get to later, and kind of charts the way that her tapestries have evolved over the years, and as one of which incorporates a performance, and then kind of expands into this 3-dimensional tapestry. tapestry of preparatory notes. So because there's so many tapestries in the show, I thought first, Goshka, just was curious if you could speak a little bit about how you became interested in this medium in particular, which of course has such a rich and long history.
So I was invited in 2009 to take part in an exhibition in Muka in Antwerp called Textiles, Art and Social Fabric, curated by Grant Watson. And he actually sort of, in a way, brought to me the whole kind of even connection to the fabricators of these tapestries, which was quite interesting because they are based in Belgium. But his exhibition very much inspired, I think, my likeness of this medium, because obviously contextualizing various works that he included in his exhibition that came from Africa, India, Brazil, it in a way indicated the power of fabric as a political tool. So, from things made by craftspeople to political banners, it was a great range of approaches in making fiber art, as it's sometimes called. And I thought that there was something really quite incredible about it, because it's quite, the relationship that you have with fabric or textile art is quite intimate in some way. It's sort of like a very different experience than you have with other mediums, and lots of them are attached to particular individual people. It's intimate for the maker as well as for the audience. At the same time as Grant was curating this exhibition, which he invited me to participate in, I was already doing my show for the Whitechapel that you can see the slide of at the back. And in a way, by coincidence somehow, the proposition to work with tapestry coincided with me actually borrowing a tapestry from United Nations, because what you see here behind the table is the copy of Guernica, which was commissioned by Nelson Rockefeller in 1955, and with the permission of Picasso, they remade 3 copies of Guernica, which obviously one hangs now as a permanent loan at the Security Council in New York. And the kind of political aura around this work coincided with what I was trying to do at the Whitechapel. And these tapestries, or the way how they were made, obviously they were made by hand, and my tapestries are made mechanically, was some sort of real beginning of the whole process. So I don't know if I should now talk about this project more in depth.
Yeah, that would be great.
So anyway, I mean, as Margot said, to describe these projects, it would probably take 1 hour to get into one particular work. So just to very quickly talk about this particular work, is the Whitechapel Gallery has got a very long history. It's an institution that exists for about probably 100 years now. And it's situated in an area in London that it's known for its kind of communist working class approach, or people who lived there were working class. It was a poor area. And during the Spanish Civil War, when Picasso's Guernica was traveling around Europe, the idea came, it was actually probably with Picasso and Roland Panros, when they decided to hire Whitechapel Gallery and bring the original Guernica as a backdrop to stage political meetings, which were supposed to raise awareness about fascism in Europe, as well as to gain the support for Spanish Civil War. So they hired the gallery for 2 weeks, and they brought the Guernica and organized many meetings which were supposed to, in a way, activate this knowledge, participation. Lots of people went from East London to fight in the Spanish Civil War as a result of this. They also collected lots of money that was then given to support different causes. And it wasn't an art show, but it had such an enormous impact. 30,000 people came to this gallery to see it. And obviously, in the history of Whitechapel, when I was asked to do this commission, it felt to me like it was one of the more important events to look into. Then, of course, there's another history of this, which is that since that time in the 30s, various people tried to do exhibitions of Picasso at the Whitechapel, which were not possible because of the politics. And that partly had to do with the politics of United States, which in a way created obstacles of borrowing stuff and showing it in East London. And for example, Nicolas Sirota, who is the director of the Tate, who wanted to bring Guernica as well as then other attempts to create Picasso shows failed in a way. So I thought that it was a nice opportunity to look for the substitute of the presence of Guernica, and I wasn't at the beginning sure how to really resolve this issue, because you can't have the original, you can't aim to really bring anything of that scale, of that kind of symbolic impact. So I came up with an idea of borrowing the tapestry from the UN, and then at the beginning it felt totally crazy, and I thought that it wouldn't be possible to do it, because of course, as you might know, there was this whole scandal when Colin Powell was sort of giving a press conference before the Security Council meeting, where he was trying to get UN to support the war in Iraq, where this tapestry was covered with a blue cloth. And the excuse for this was that it was so graphically busy that it just didn't serve the right purpose to be at the back of Colin Powell. And, of course, lots of people were sort of completely shocked by this. But I felt that through this connection, this work, in a way, almost gained its own importance or historical importance, and had a different sort of aura, perhaps even than the original work, which was allowing me to, in a way, jump the connection from the Spanish Civil War into more contemporary war context. So Ivona Blaswick, who is the director of the Whitechapel, when she heard about the idea of borrowing this tapestry, she was actually very enthusiastic, immediately made some sort of connection with, I can't remember even who, but the answer was positive, and we could have this original copy of Guernica in the Whitechapel project, my project, for 1 year. So
That's Colin Powell. This was also shown alongside as part of the exhibition. So it included the tapestry, which Nelson Rockefeller commissioned, I think it was in '55, with the permission of Picasso, to make this tapestry. And then since the '80s, it's been on loan at the United Nations headquarters here in New York, and been on permanent view. I think the only time that it wasn't on view was the time when Colin Powell covered it, and the time when you took it to Whitechapel.
yeah.
And here he is holding the vial of anthrax, which did he do this in the speech?
Yes, because this sculpture is actually based on the photograph of Colin Powell presenting his case for the Security Council. And of course, now since then he apologized for this, and we all know that it was a completely orchestrated performance, more like rather than a kind of something truthful situation. And he has been obviously very much criticized by many people for doing this. But no, this is based on the actual photograph, and I made this also in the Cubist style, because I thought that I sort of thought that the Cubist style symbolized some sort of like a deconstruction of his integrity as a politician, like taking him apart into all these different forms was an appropriate way of illustrating him in my exhibition. So maybe also it's worth to say that the tapestries that we see here in the show at the New Museum, they are by themselves, but I often show them with other stuff. So for example, at the Whitechapel, there was the Colin Powell. We also had a table which was used by the public for meetings, and in order to have a meeting, one had to kind of put a proposal in place, and I only requested for people to provide me with photographs and some sort of documentation of the meeting after. And these meetings took place over a period of 1 year, which then sort of created another beneficial scenario, because all of this material now is part of the archive of Guernica at the Whitechapel Gallery. So through this project and through the meetings and the participation of people, I extended the archive of the Whitechapel, which wasn't really very big. And now actually the majority of the material comes from my project. And then on the top of the table, we had another sort of program of independent film screening. So it was a complete environment and not just one image. But what you see here in the exhibition was made actually after my exhibition ended in 2009.
So could you speak a little bit about the meetings and the idea behind that? Was that something that happened originally in Whitechapel in the 30s, or?
Well, the meetings were happening at the Whitechapel for 2 weeks, and when I proposed this interactive meeting-based program to the Whitechapel, I think that they were slightly afraid of having to have the project like this there for 1 year and dealing with the perspective of hosting meetings for 1 year. So, you know, they responded quite negatively to my, you know, to my sort of proposition. And then I basically tricked them because I had quite a lot of press interest. So I had lots of interviews with newspapers, and this was quite a popular show because obviously it happened, you know, as a first commission in the expanded space of the Whitechapel Gallery. So there was a lot of press coverage for this, and I basically, each time when I gave an interview, I said, well, if anybody wants to use this table and this space for meetings, please email this address and book yourself in. So then we received so many requests that they had to kind of take on this whole program for a year, and it wasn't really discussed anymore after, you know, it was just
And what kind of meetings took place? Like, was there, you know, any parameters to that, or was
So there was a lots of meetings, and actually some of them were really humbling to me because there were people still alive who went to fight in the Spanish Civil War.
Wow.
So, you know, and also the kind of aura of Guernica, you know, I didn't go to all of these meetings because it was pretty much every day, sometimes 2 meetings a day, and obviously the whole year. But sometimes when I visited the show, you could see that there was this amazing sort of, you know, respect and amazing kind of ritual almost around the table, around the tapestry, with old people, young people. So the group age of people who came and really sat down and enjoyed this whole situation was very broad. And the meetings also reflected on that. So of course there were student meetings, there were different groups meetings, there were sort of publishers meetings, and there were people who also wanted to do meetings which we didn't particularly support. For example, pro-war meetings, or kind of, you know, so there was like, people really wanted to use this as a democratic platform. And I guess maybe it would have been quite good to allow people to really use it as they liked, but you know, the kind of institutional politics, as well as I guess my understanding of how this work was supposed to be used, you know, we kind of filtered what was shown there, or what was happening around this table.
It's quite amazing to have a meeting in front of Guernica that's pro-war, like just that idea.
Yeah.
I mean, and also like the tapestry. Like I think it's so fascinating that it's like that you didn't show the actual painting, that it's the tapestry version of the painting. So it's like this way that this image sort of, I don't know, becomes a symbol and stands for something separate from, I mean, sometimes like in, you know, a completely different context than how the work was made originally, that I think is really fascinating. Yeah.
But you know, yesterday I was in a taxi, and there are these little screens in yellow taxis, and there was an interior designer talking about her work, and she made this Guernica chair, and I was trying to figure out what was the relationship to Guernica, and I think that she basically took on the reference to the bull and made a chair which kind of at the back had this sort of hair of a bull hanging out. So it was a regular chair with some sort of fringe-like decoration that she nominated as a Guernica chair, which was very fun. I kind of liked it. I almost thought that I should find her and somehow discuss with her the meanings of symbols.
So the tapestry, just going back to the work that's in the show that you made, was that made for that exhibition at MUCA, the one that explored the history of political tapestry?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And then the people that are in this image, this kind of composite, are where do they come from? Like,
so yes, okay, so we have this image already. So this is actually in the exhibition at MUCA, and you can see that it's the backdrop from my exhibition with Prince William and various officials gathered together for his speech. And I basically collaged lots of these people. They did come to the Whitechapel for different opening events, but they weren't there all at the same time as it is illustrated here. And Prince William did give a speech for the opening of the Whitechapel, which is another funny story because, you know, it was the first time in the last 25 years that a member of the royal family came to Whitechapel. And in order to do this, he flew with a helicopter to a local hospital and then took a taxi because he was too scared to drive in his car, you know, to that kind of like working class, not anymore, of course, but sort of far away from Buckingham Palace area. So anyway, and as an introduction, you know, he wanted to kind of present himself as a very aware of arts person, and he said, my real name is Banksy. You know, which everybody was like, what? And anyway, so this itself was completely ridiculous. You know, the idea of institutions now, contemporary institutions in Great Britain, inviting a member of royal family to inaugurate opening of the space is already a joke. You know, it's so I sort of was already critical towards this. And then, of course, there were other people who came to this that were more problematic for me, like people who sponsor arts and actually their money comes from dealing arms and, you know, filtering various information. So I kind of felt like, you know, there was a certain naivety within what I did when I expected people to kind of come to this table with a good aim. And, you know, this also represents what the art world is made of. You know, it's this time in history where you see lots of people making money quickly from aims that perhaps artists don't really approve of, and then trying to clear their conscience by investing this money in supporting institutions. So this was kind of a commentary on that general scheme of things. And in a way, I found myself quite naive within this scenario. So to accompany this work, I commissioned a Belgian critic and a curator to write a critique on me that was exposed, that was shown with this tapestry that was basically made in 2009 when just before my exhibition at the Whitechapel was finishing. So within, you know, so it's a critique that it's kind of somehow controlled by me, but I thought that it was a kind of, you know, rather than me criticizing myself, it was better that somebody else criticized me, and I included this in the work.
So just moving on to the following project that's in the exhibition. This was a project that you did for the Walker Art Center, and kind of a beginning of a series of exhibitions that you first were in residence there at the Walker, and kind of while you were in residence, delved deep into the history of the institution and kind of unearthed these kind of overlooked histories and stories and peculiarities that existed within it. And I'm curious to know, like, through your process in working on an exhibition like this in a residency, were there like a specific set of interests that you had like coming into it, or was there a way that the research process and looking at the institution's history kind of brought you to these uncharted territories that you didn't anticipate at the time?
Well, my residency was kind of enforced by circumstances, because I actually went for the site visit to Minneapolis, and then there was the volcano in Iceland, which stopped all the planes flying to Europe. So the residency wasn't designed to happen then, but I was stuck in Minneapolis, so we kind of had to commit to the show, and then I started, I used my time to look into the archive, into the history of institution, the history of the building, also kind of looked at Minneapolis and what was happening then. Then, of course, there was a very particular political aura in United States anyway, which I had great interest in. So, within these 2 weeks, I kind of formed some ideas about the walker. And of course, since the context is always important to my work, because I believe that if you're putting something into an institution, the work will always be read with the filter of this institution and its history being part of it. So I very early decided to address this reading of the context within the work, and in a way that often became then a very strong part of the work itself. So this case is obviously here very present because, I start off with references to T.B. Walker, who gained his fortune from the lumbering industry, basically cutting the native forests, then invested his money into collecting art, and then obviously the transformations happened for the Walker to become a public institution with the expansion that took place in, God, now I forgot even when the expansion happened, but it was designed by Herzog and de Meuron. And of course, there was a whole kind of campaign trying to frame the whole reasons for the expansion, and also the way how the institution tried to identify itself. And the slogan that Walker was using frequently was that the Walker was supposed to function as a town square. So, if we looked at town square that was more based within the cultural aspects, all of the function of the Walker was sort of quite logical. But then when we looked at the town square in actual town of Minneapolis, there were various other things going on. So at that time, of course, the Tea Party was very present. And when I was there was the Tea Party rally, which I went to. So I was trying to see how you can kind of translate these activities of the town square into the activity of the institution itself. Plus, of course, I looked at the different directors, which had a big impact on the kind of aura of the institution, the collection of the Walker, which I think that regardless if it's an institution or a private collection, in a way the collection somehow defines the collector. So all of these things were taken to count to create this work. And then, of course, thinking of the history of the Walker and the lumbering industry, I found out that there was a big part of a forest which was saved from lumbering, and it was called Lost 40 in Minneapolis. And we intended to go to this place to basically take photographs to become the background for the tapestry. I was also looking at the forest as a kind of metaphor for history. Like in my language, there's this saying when you say that the further you go into the forest, the more trees you find. And in a way, it's the same metaphor when you try to define research. And the further you go into the research, the more information you find, which defines really, the truth. So I placed all these different figures that in a way played part within the context of the forest. But then, of course, within the exhibition, there were also other works which were quite political, which were part of the Walker's collection, that kind of looked in a broader sense at everything that has happened there. And then the more importantly, the dimension of the show, as well as the proportion of the whole the whole structure that we've built was also looking from a critical perspective into the architectural approach of Herzog and de Muren versus the original Barnes building that was built in the 70s. So, so there was lots of stuff there that I could talk about for a long time, but that's a kind of rough structure of this work, or how it came together in a way.
Yeah. And for the interest in time, we're just going to go to the next project, which this is kind of the beginning of the performance for. But it's this piece, The Letter, which you created for the Zakieta Museum in Warsaw, where you're from. And of course, this project that you did kind of applies this typical methodology that you were doing with the Walker, of like looking into the institution's archives and its history. It's interesting because it was also your first exhibition in your native country. So I'm curious how this project in particular kind of differed from the past projects like you were doing at other institutions, because it not only tied into the history of Zakieta and its specific relationship to the communities and the politics in Poland, but also to your own history and own background.
Yes. So that exhibition was really like, well, the only kind of big exhibition that I had in an institution in Warsaw since I left. I left in '89. And of course, '89 is an important date because, it's the collapse of the Eastern Bloc and collapse of the Berlin Wall. And also big changes that took place in Warsaw, and big changes in culture, which meant a lot to the artists and institutions. So this piece is kind of part of a much larger display that had other works that weren't tapestries. But through this exhibition, in a way, I had an opportunity to look at the time of my absence and really analyze what happened there. And of course, this big debate around the kind of new identity of the Polish culture. So, of course, since the communists collapsed, there was a promise of freedom, and everybody was having great hopes that now, we can start a new chapter and everything is going to be great and we're going to progress really fast. But instead, perhaps this had to do lots with the kind of nature of the Polish Revolution that was attached to Catholic Church. The church was very much present in Polish politics, and lots of parties that represented Catholic Christian families took a very strong stand against institutions in Warsaw and different people who worked for these institutions. So there were various attacks on Jewish curators. There were attacks against anything that had to do with any kind of misplacement of Christian values. There was, of course, like a massive sort of response to anything to do with sort of gay, lesbian politics, anything to do with sex. So rather than going forward, it looked like things were kind of moving backwards. And there is basically like a great material which is partly with Zachęta, but also with other institutions that suffered from these attacks, and as well as the Polish TV that I got access to through different institutions that were helping me over a period of a year to collect all this material. And then this piece kind of in a way resonates on something that I felt was perhaps quite interesting, because I always looked at this work, which was made in 1967. I mean, the whole performance of Cantor consisted on these 7 or 8 postmen carrying the big banner that was painted to look like a letter. And that was walked through the streets of Warsaw. You had a number of reporters in different parts of the strip that were reporting to the gallery. And in the gallery, you already had an audience waiting, which, when the letter actually arrived at the Vauxhall Gallery, the public attacked the letter and destroyed it. So I kind of made a comparison, or I thought that this was a sort of significant possibility of comparing this to the Berlin Wall anyway. And it's a slightly different kind of composition than what I did with other tapestries, because it's kind of like a wall without a great perspective, rather than the other works which kind of draw you in and look more like a landscape. So
So this is the tapestry, and here it is in an installation view. But this project kind of came from the original performance was Tadeusz Kantor's 1967 happening of the same title, The Letter, that you restaged. So this is the performance that you did in Warsaw.
yes, I mean, the reason, what I thought, the fact that it was a letter, it was the essence of the correspondence between the public and the institutions. So people sent anonymous letter with abusive anonymous letters. People sent letters of complaints. People really tried to communicate in the form of letter how they felt about art and culture at that time. So of course it was appropriate to restage this big letter that was somehow mirroring to the public, what they have been kind of engaged with and still are, because this is now even more present, I guess, than it was a few years ago, because we have another government that is extremely conservative and not very tolerant. So all these events, even when we try to discuss after my exhibition with different people who worked for press, that perhaps this is very much about something historical, we know and we've realized that this is something that is still ongoing, and it's probably not going to stop anywhere near soon.
And some of the events that I was reading about that happened at Curator, which I thought were quite remarkable to even think about now, were there's this one famous story that I think of when Maurizio Cattelan's sculpture La Nona Ora, which had Pope John Paul II being struck by a meteor, was vandalized by two Polish MPs, right? And in the show, not only did you show the tapestry, but also some archival material kind of related to these attacks on artworks, as well as on the institution and its curators and director. And there were some registrar's footage of the
Damage.
the damage that occurred to that sculpture.
Well, I mean, basically, these MPs try to use the kind of aura of that time, the fact that the media was interested in culture and all these scandals. So this was kind of to gain popularity. They broke into the museum during the night through the skylight of the museum, and they tried to lift the meteorite of the Pope's body and sit him up in a more respectable position. It's completely ridiculous, but I mean, there were consequences to this, because this was a serious act of vandalism. And this happened by people who were political or less political actors, who came and destroyed images of themselves within the work of other artists. I mean, this went on and on and on, and to the extent that various artists had to go to court and were facing 6 months in prison for example, combining an image of genitals with a cross or doing something like this. Or even, of course, international art that was shown in Poland that was also attacked because it contextualized the beliefs of Polish people in a kind of not in a way that they approved of. So, and this letter, the original letter obviously was addressed to Foxal Gallery. This letter was addressed to the Zachęta Gallery.
Right. So it was paraded through the streets. Did it end at Zachęta also?
This
the similar?
Yes.
Yeah. And these are two tapestries. This is a more recent project that you did for the last Documenta, which was interesting because these two tapestries that you produced for this international art exhibition were actually not seen together, but rather seen at the two separate venues of Documenta. And the Documenta 13 iteration had two separate venues, one in pass over. It always exists. And then also had a satellite location that was in Kabul in Afghanistan. There was a seminar where they invited like all of the artists and curators and people working on the show to kind of get together and all go to Afghanistan and kind of think about what the plans for the show. I'm just curious to know a bit about how this project developed, and specifically like how being in Afghanistan during that time. I mean, I know that it was also during a time when the land was like occupied by NATO and other U.S. troops that were in the city, and how that experience of being there during that occupation kind of informed this project.
Yeah, so this was definitely an exciting trip. I mean, I even had a will written before I left, and I had to ask for an emergency will. So this man came to my house in a black suit, and my cat saw him and was totally freaked out, like, what is this man doing here? Because he obviously had a certain aura of death, and he said, so why emergency will? Are you dying? Are you terminally? And I said, no, I'm just going to a war zone. So we signed a will. And then, of course, that wasn't really the end of it. So what I did, because basically there was a whole program of events in Afghanistan and only some artists were invited to go there. And for this work, I organized this lunch meeting where I invited different cultural representatives as well as NGOs, and attempted to invite people who were more there for diplomatic purposes to kind of really show what this whole group of people that were, that was living in Afghanistan at the time was made of. So the unfortunate thing was obviously that when I was flying there was a massive snowfall, as you can see on the image, and I was stuck in Turkey for 24 hours. Then I was stuck in Dubai. I flew all around the world in order to find a way to go to Afghanistan, which was obviously very limited then. And finally, when I arrived there, obviously completely impossible to commute even. One was stuck in the traffic for 5 hours because of the snow. And then being stuck in the traffic, you were, surrounded by different convoys of American military or different military with machine guns pointing at everybody in the traffic, which sort of didn't really feel that comfortable at all. And plus, for me as a woman, it wasn't easy to really go around the streets because we couldn't really walk around the streets. I needed to have a permission to take photographs on the street, and the first time when I took the camera out, I already had military and police around me asking me what I was doing. So it was kind of a challenging scenario, but finally we managed to restage or reorganize this lunch. Not everybody came, but it was kind of very much to create the context of Documenta in Afghanistan for people to see in the West, and not many people went to the opening of Documenta in Afghanistan for obvious reasons. But in a way, I felt that there was a certain impossibility of translating this kind of, event that is created in the West, and it was created in Kassel because the castle was completely bombed and destroyed during the Second World War. So the first gesture in the 50s, which was sort of orchestrated by Arnold Bode, was to create an art event to, in a way, show some kind of hope in the future, that was mediated by culture. And one can apply this also to Afghanistan, but perhaps it was too early to really see this hope or see that this change might take place. So, the kind of proposal of the director of Documenta 13 to go to Afghanistan was not necessarily addressing the context of war, was more based on the interest of the kind of avant-garde of the 70s, like Boetti going to Afghanistan, hanging out, taking drugs. So even in the introduction of during the opening in in Kabul, Carolyn Christoph was talking about, her kind of interest of going to Afghanistan to trace Boetti's steps. And she kind of proposed something that was also indicating that she wanted to do it as if the war did not exist. And I thought that it was really difficult to take this on, to really function within this situation and imagine that the war did not exist. Also, if you translate it into the participation of the local artists, especially women taking place in the event, you can give them certain promise of freedom for the time being of the documenta, 3 months, or the presence of the documenta curators, where they could feel comfortable with working and being themselves. But then the moment you leave these people. And of course, we know from the whole kind of time when the war in Afghanistan was taking place that lots of women really suffered from being partly liberated by NGOs, being partly given some kind of encouragement to feel free and to feel strong. And then the next moment they were murdered even by their family members, or totally restricted to do absolutely anything, including having an education. So, I really wanted to scrutinize the situation. I wanted to look at the economy of Afghanistan, the real economy versus the economy that was somehow created by the presence of foreigners. And I felt that the money which was then, of course, spent into the organization of Documenta in Kabul, which was probably about €1 million, was just adding to this illusion of this economy and creating great confusion there. So I clearly felt critical towards this. I felt critical towards the logistics of how Documenta was organized, because military brought our works, the sort of different Afghan officials, which one could question right now, were part of it or accepted this, and they were part of the whole event. And I made this work as well as the other work that you can see now, that in a way is showing the other context, the other side, which is the Western side. And with this, I also produced a newspaper with a text which was kind of very much describing my position within all of this.
And what was the reasoning? I mean, I know that this is obviously at Kabul, and this building behind is the Darul Aman Palace, which translates to abode of peace. It's interesting because it was this building that when it was built was, in this height of European architecture. And then in the years since the time that it was built has been destroyed in the successive wars that have happened since. And here, and then that piece in Kabul was shown in Kassel, whereas this one, which depicts the orangerie in Kassel, where during the time when you received the Arnold Bode Prize, was shown in Kabul. And having these two separate tapestries in these two separate locations, what was the kind of ideas that you had behind not showing them at the same place at the same time?
Well, I mean, it was about these different truths that are attached to different contexts and the impossibility of kind of mirroring this context, really. So it was a very simple formula of dividing the project into the two locations and showing how these two locations are meaningless in a way. When you sort of try to respond, like for people who came to visit the Documenta in Afghanistan, the only thing that sort of in a way was paradoxical, that because these tapestries are so, visually interesting and all the figures are almost life-size, that people were always taking photographs of themselves and expanding the plane of the tapestry into the real life. So, but of course they couldn't respond to anybody who was on the picture because it was a completely alien group of people. And this worked in both locations in a similar way, a part of having, Carolyn Christoph, Jus Martinez, and different people who were really part of the institution that were present in both places.
Yeah, of course. So the next work is Death of Marxism, Women of All Lands Unite, which is different from a lot of your other tapestries because it doesn't speak to the history of one institution or, one international art exhibition in particular, but is more, tied to the history of, representation of women and objectification of women more broadly. But also it differs from the other tapestries, and I think kind of extends from what you were doing with them in that, these tapestries, and, you'll certainly notice this in the galleries, really implicate the viewer inside them. They almost like transform architectural space, so you can, kind of inhabit them or see yourself within them. And I think that this work in particular is interesting because it's a three-dimensional tapestry as opposed to something that is just on the plane of the wall. And, by having it, occupy the floor and the wall, it really does implicate the viewer within it. And, it differs from the other ones in a third way, actually, because it incorporates a performance. And which is, draws this real immediacy to it. It's almost as if you're like teasing out the idea of demonstration and performance that exists within each of the tapestries, and, creating these environments for performance and for participation in a way to take place.
So yes, I mean, this was definitely a very different project that kind of happened without me really looking for the opportunity to make this, but I was approached by a foundation called the Tichy Foundation, which is in a way kind of archiving Tichy's work. Mirosław Tichy was a photographer that lived in Czechoslovakia, the old Czechoslovakia, and basically took maybe 90 photographs a day of women of this small place called Kiev. And Tichy was an artist who had a nervous breakdown, and he was an alcoholic. And I think that the circumstances of living in a communist country, which he really was kind of against the whole system, even more magnified his sort of mental state, or like the reasons for his sort of emotional collapse. So he very much lived like an outsider. He didn't have any recognition as a photographer. And in his house, which was a house of a kind of really poor person with like soil on the ground rather than a floor, he printed his photos, he made his own lenses, and he walked around and took photos of women, some of them of young girls. So there's this enormous body of work made by Tichy. And when I first saw these photographs, of course, I felt certain discomfort, but then I kind of identified myself with the images of these women because I lived in communist context at the same time as lots of these photos were taken. So I felt like, there was some kind of reason for me to really examine this and look at this more more profoundly. And so I produced actually a large body of work, not just this tapestry. I produced different collages where I really look at his kind of, way of framing his work, the way of printing, the kind of texture of his photographs. It was a very sort of long process of going through various materials. And then I guess I wanted to also deal with this dynamic of his voyeurism, or how he kind of approached women and how one can feel about the depiction of women in his work. So for which I produced this piece, which creates a space, a three-dimensional space that you can, the performer or whoever is in this space is in a way protected by the kind of boundaries which are created within this space. And then came up with the idea of actually reproducing some of his drawings and creating these suits that exist as artworks in their own right. These drawings are very much on his kind of fantasies of women clothing that are obviously very explicit, but I wanted to do something that really creates a complete cover for women's bodies. So in a way plays with this idea of exposure and complete covering of oneself, or some kind of protection by the outfit, and plus setting it up within the context of that space where you can look, but you don't feel a great comfort, and the girls can feel comfortable within their own space, and they don't have to necessarily respond to the public. There was, I guess, a similar dynamic going on then with what I felt about his relationship to women, and then somehow the kind of recollection on that.
And the Marx's tombstone here, which is originally in Highgate Cemetery, has kind of been transported into this bucolic environment by a riverbank, and these women are kind of visiting it almost as paying homage to it. And the slogan, you can't probably see it in this image that's on the tombstone, is the Marxist, very famous Marxist slogan, "Workers of all lands unite," this call to end class struggle. And in the title of this work, is "Women of all lands unite." And, was there a way that you were kind of using this work almost as a call to action for women to kind of
Well,
escape?
obviously, but I kind of wanted to do it in a humorous way. So, this kind of gathering of naked women around Mark's grave, I thought that it was a pretty ridiculous situation. And then, of course, it's a feminist call, and it's, it's maybe something that kind of, in a way, acts against his, the whole kind of chemistry of his photography. But I think that it does the job, it works pretty well. And yes, it's, like with lots of these works that, and also the way probably how I talk about it, they look very serious, but there's always some kind of element of humor within it, and this one specifically.
Of course. Which brings us to a comedy. This is the work Preparatory Notes, which is the most recent work that's on view in the exhibition that was produced and shown, the play of which was shown at the 2014 Berlin Biennale. I'm kind of interested in, since this is like the work that kind of followed this project that you were doing with Death to Marxism, how this set almost functions in a way as a three-dimensional tapestry. And there's this way that I think it also makes you look, just by seeing the set in the space without the play taking place, at the various characters that exist within it, that are portrayed in these cardboard cutouts, and how their viewer kind of senses or comes up with their own associations between what may have happened between these various characters in the play, and how they're interconnected within one another. And I'm curious to know if you feel that, seeing this work in the context of the tapestries, that there's this connection that exists, like, between the stage set as this, site for performance, as how it kind of connects to the tapestries themselves.
Well, I think that you should make this connection. No, I mean, obviously there is a connection, but it's a really subjective kind of way of looking at this.
Yeah.
And I guess, for me, when I look at this, because I work, the process of making the tapestries is like a collage. It's a digital collage. So you bring different things into one flat surface that belongs to different historical times. It belongs to different, sort of occupies different territories. And then it's united into one area. I mean, this play, in a way, does the same thing, because it goes into 19th century, it looks at Abby Warburg as a kind of main character, and a play that he wrote at the end of 19th century called Preparatory Notes for Hamburg Comedy. And that play was a critique of Hamburg art scene of his time. It wasn't staged, it was only staged, it wasn't properly staged in the theater, but it was staged for a family gathering for the New Year's Eve celebrations, I think, of his family. And as you might know, Warburg comes from the Warburg banking family, which part of his family and the bank also exists still in United States. But when he was given the kind of opportunity to run the business of the banking, he asked his younger brother to take over on the condition that he would get enough money to buy all the books that he ever wanted to create his library and do his art historian research, which lots of artists is really interested in his research because his approach was very unorthodox. Also, his life story is very interesting. He had schizophrenia, spent most of his life in a mental institution. So there's this genius and this really kind of remarkable person that created this new system of categorization of knowledge, who is at the same time completely crazy and is locked up in an institution for probably about 10 years or something, with literally spending all his time screaming. So when he finally was released from the mental institution, he couldn't even speak. His voice was completely destroyed by his own sort of schizophrenic fits. So, but I've always really liked Warburg, and my interest in Warburg started with another project, which obviously we don't have anything about this project in the show here. But I was really interested in his studies on the lecture on which he wrote about the snake ritual of the Hopi tribes. That coincided with, well, he did a trip around United States, and he went to the Hopi territories with the people who then, I mean, obviously, as you probably know, lots of the native lands were exposed to a lot of voyeurism by people coming and literally coming and trying to take photographs and kind of interact when the expansion of the American frontier took place, and Warburg was part of it. So the secret rituals which were characteristic for Northern American tribes were mediated in photographs that he took, but also then lots of stuff was stolen and sold to the museums. So there was a real kind of serious attack on culture, but not just through interaction with the sort of rituals or the kind of environments. It was obviously much more aggressive, as we know. And his recollection of the strip, and especially his study of the snake ritual lecture, was the kind of lecture that helped him to get out of the mental institution. So this was my first interaction with Warburg. Then when I did this research at the Warburg Institute in London, I came across the play, which is not even translated into English. It exists as a manuscript. So not many people know about this play. And then, obviously, when I produced this this performance, we kind of co-wrote, and I collaborated with Dieter Rostrater on writing the script as well as partly the research. And that took place in Chicago. I was doing a small residency in Chicago at the MCA, and Dieter was working there. So this place linked up to Chicago purely by the fact that we were both working in that context. And of course, the shift here, again, it's like coming from the Hamburg comedy, but then going to the contemporary context of the art scene, which we have today, but traveling through time, through the 60s, and the exhibition, for example, curated by Jan van der Mark at the MCA Chicago in 1967, which was called Art by Phone. This, in a way, relates to Warburg in a kind of really humorous way, because he had a massive fear of technology, and he thought that technology would destroy civilization and human spirit. So, of course, Angela Merkel also comes to it with the phone hacking scandal. So there's lots of random things that are brought together, but they somehow fit very well in the play. And we can play a little short kind of part of the documentation or the video that represents the play.
Okay, this is the crazy part.
As is well enough known, I lost my marbles for a bit there. I had always been quite an excitable and nervous type, but finally experienced a major collapse in in the fall of 1918, just in time to coincide with the collapse of the German Empire, in fact. Yes.
Deutschland! Deutschland! Über!
Deutschland unter anderem.
For a little while, Warburg was shipped from one nursing home to another until he came under the care of Dr. Ludwika Binswanger of Kreuzlingen, where she ran a sanatorium unironically named
Bellevue. You know that somewhere in Switzerland. For a couple of years, my situation looked positively hopeless. Until 1923, that is when I started to recover. And to prove to my doctors that I was ready for the real world again and that I had regained my mental stability, I proposed to give a lecture to my fellow patients about the Hopi snake ritual I had heard about so many years ago. I never really saw it myself. Well, I can be more precise than that. The snake ritual I had heard about in 1896, which is when I traveled to America for the first and the only time in my life. Anyway, my lecture on the serpent ritual, my interest in serpentine imagery across cultures and through the ages, it is a well-established trope. I would say,
Beginning with Adam and Eve.
yeah, moving to the Laocoon Group.
Ja, wie Sie alle wissen, setzt sich fort, ja, zu den Pueblo-Indianern im Südwesten Amerikas und rund um die Welt. Also ich meine, durch all diese Kulturen der Primitiven.
Excuse me, but who are you calling primitive here? What do you think I am anyway? Just some fucking tourist attraction?
Apologies, my dear fellow, I did not mean to insult you or anything.
I know that we're in a museum of ethnology here, which makes a lot of things look like the work of illiterate savages, but still, indeed, why can't the art of us so-called others ever been shown as art in an art museum? And if it is accepted or regarded as art at all, why only as outsider art? Aren't we all inside the same world of art? Oh, getting started again. I could go on forever. Oh well, okay. About your serpent ritual.
Snake can follow the energy of the planet wherever you put them.
Marina! I was waiting for you to pipe in. We were all waiting for you to pipe in. Now, if I remember correctly, you actually have performed a snake dance come serpent ritual of your own, have you not?
You must be thinking of the performance I did with Ulay back in Wiesbaden in 1978 called 3.
That's the one. I remember you banging on about it before.
There was a snake indeed. The two of us plus snake made 3.
That's right.
We were lying flat on our stomachs together in one room with Snake. We tried to make contact with Snake. We used a closed circuit of wire, blowing into a bottle, or plucking the wire with our fingers. This would coax Snake to make a choice. To find the direction of which it received the vibrations, mine or Ulay's. Was it any surprise that Snake was obviously much more interested in me than in Ulay?
No, Marina.
I don't think so. So I end up flat in front of Snake, kind of communicating with it by mirroring its movements.
But it was measuring you, right? To see whether you'd fit inside it, to see whether it could eat you.
Oh, I didn't know that. This snake has often been construed to symbolize evil. Yet, naturally, it represented something much more positive. It symbolized the creation of the universe, no? Can I add something about performance art here? I don't know if this performance piece is a performance piece or not. I mean, this Macuga woman, is she performance artist? It is all very fine, this Hamburg comedy business, but performance art has to live and survive. It cannot be put on walls. If we do not perform and recreated the art fuckers,
Ha, art fuckers.
theater fuckers,
Theatre
the
fuckers.
dance fuckers,
Dance
will
fuckers.
rip us off. I am sick and tired of the mistreatment of performance art. Even the pop video fuckers steal from it.
Love it, Marina. Art fuckers. That's a good one. Ha, I'm in agreement with you there. Though, don't you think the snake also symbolises forbidden pleasure? Adam and Eve and the snake in the Garden of Eden, remember?
Anyway, so this is just a little part of the play. As you can see, it's like random how things come together. So Warburg with Marina Abramovich, with sort of various different bits and pieces. But at the end, I thought that it was kind of like what I wanted to do, really.
It's interesting to see. This is also like, if you want to see the whole video, is playing here in the theater every Wednesday all day, for the duration of the show. So you can check out more of it too. And I'm gonna open it up to questions from the audience in a bit. But I have one more question before I do. I just having seen this and all of the kind of works together in the show. Of course, like as I mentioned in the beginning, it's quite different than all the projects that we've been talking about because, of course, it's the first time that all of these works have kind of been seen together. And Goshka, I'm interested in, I know like the symbol of the serpent, for example, has kind of come up in many of your other works, like in the Brothers piece that is currently on view at MoMA now, but is also referenced in the Kabul tapestry, as well as in the Tea Party signs that are in the Walker. I think that it's interesting to see these works in one space because there's almost these like unexpected connections that occur between them. If bringing them together for you, do you see that there are certain dialogues that emerge between them, or like how do you feel kind of seeing these works that you've made in this period kind of come together for the first time?
Well, basically, it sort of like reassures me that my previous idea of context being important is significant in making art or how you read art. So by putting the works together, you obviously create a completely different reading that maybe would have not occurred to even my own mind unless I saw it in that kind of situation. And yes, it's interesting to see this. It's quite challenging to see so much information because for me, all of this symbolizes much more than one project without my sort of memory or recap of how this works became what they are. So, so for me, it's a kind of slight sort of overload of info, it's really strong, but at the same time, it's interesting to see them like this.
Yeah, definitely.
But I'm also quite happy that, you kind of had a certain concept about how this worked for you and that this context, in a way, on this occasion wasn't completely orchestrated by me. It was more like your responsibility. So,
and then the title "Time is Fabric" was something that you came up with after we talked a little bit about seeing all of these works together, which of course relates to Einstein's theory of relativity. This idea of time as being this fabric, and I wanted to know if you could elaborate on that idea a little bit.
Well, it's a very long conversation. I mean, I think that it's now like
it's late.
8:30.
All right.
But so what I wanted to say just very quickly, I do have an interest in science, and I did start doing some research at CERN in Geneva, which is you probably know the particle, the experiments with particles that were happening initially in Chicago at Fermilab, and now, of course, the expanded version of this is in Geneva, in CERN. So I started different conversations with scientists there, but obviously, as far as we are now, it hasn't materialized in a work, and maybe it will materialize in a theater play. But the kind of lingo of the scientists have become a little bit more familiar to me now, because I had to study things in relationship to that. And then at the same time, I'm also interested in the kind of new ways of studying, or like new departments of knowledge. So I sometimes independently go to MIT website and watch stuff on a computer learning or something ridiculous. There's there's obviously a big limitation of how far I go with this, because my memory of mathematical equations is not so great now, even that I was quite good at maths and physics. So, but I think that it's a very interesting moment for science. So I think that lots of people follow what's going on, and it's something that artists also respond to, and lots of these institutions that deal with very sophisticated science are very open to collaborating with artists and running some arts programs. So yeah, in a way, this is kind of like a beginning to a new chapter that hasn't completely formed itself. It's just purely now existing in the form of dialogue.
It's a nice way to end it.
But also, time as fabric, if we follow Einstein theory, and if it is about time and space, which is then disturbed by big objects, these tapestries are so massive that I think that they have a universal impact just by the scale of them. So kind of, in a way, it's a joke as well on the definition of which is more sort of scientific approach from the Einstein's perspective. It's a kind of distortion of what he had in mind, in a way.
All right, so because it's 8:30, I will open it up to 2 questions from the audience. 2, only time for 2. We wait for the microphone. Hold on one second.
I'm wondering why you didn't decide to not do the Kabul project. I mean, you said you were very critical of it. Why did you just say, okay, I'm not?
Well, because I think that if you don't do something, then it doesn't exist. The question then is not asked or addressed. So it's this sort of, it's this kind of dilemma about protesting, or, going on the street and manifesting against some kind of situation that one doesn't feel happy with. Of course, we often decide not to do it, but I think that doing it is a better way somehow. Not to feel like you kind of chickened out, Not doing it. It is, but this was a discussion that I had with other artists participating, and they couldn't get it. They couldn't get this whole thing of the going to document and the problems attached to it as a problem. So it was, but I mean, this is often ignored in so many different circumstances, that you just do it because the opportunity is there. But I kind of didn't want to just do it for the sake of participating. I did it, and I kind of wanted to somehow do it consciously. But definitely not doing it would have been worse, because my doing it then provoked the response from Documenta. So Documenta had to explain themselves much more why they were there and what their aims were. if I didn't raise this subject, they would have never had to answer to anything, you know. Yes, of course. Yeah, but you know, lots of people are sitting at home and not doing anything, and not even, like in my country, they don't even go to vote, and then we have this crazy governments. Imagine if in the United States people didn't go to vote for the kind of opposition to conservatives, and Trump would become a president. It could happen.
Speaking. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being so generous with your time. So I'm really fascinated with photography, and I wanted to invite you to speak more about photography's role, and especially like the creation of the tapestries. I was trying to, there was like a quotation running through my head. I forget who said it. It might have been Roland Barthes, about how the same century that invented history invented photography, and that there's always this intimate relationship, and tapestry is also a medium that's, you know, deeply like intertwined with history and representing like history itself, you know. So I just wanted to know more about like what your concept was behind using photographs. Like, why not just do a sketch of something and then render a tapestry from that? Like, what's the fascination there with the real?
Well, I think that, you know, also, well, first of all, it's probably quite transparent that even the choices made about using black and white have a link to documentary photography. So it's about capturing the truth. You know, it's about representing something that you immediately associate with some sort of form or medium that it's associated to journalism, or something that is supposed to speak about the truth. So I was interested in that. And of course, if we relate to, you know, more theoretical approach, you know, I mean, it's like almost a firm sort of a scene that you would maybe find more mediated in the film, where you have all these different characters coming from different historical places that come together into one, you know, one event, and that event is then documented by a shot, you know, a kind of like a film frame or whatever, or a photographic frame. So, you know, so there's lots of things. I mean, in the relationship to more political issues that I try to talk about, definitely the aspect of the documentary journalism was very important to me. But then I looked at the political banners, I looked at propaganda art, you know, I looked at many things. You know, you know, this is maybe why Guernica is so genius, because it's not a real photographic image or a realistic representation of war and has got this enormous power. But if we think of other scenarios where this was as successful as Guernica, you know, there aren't that many examples of that. So I guess I went for photography because it is something that sort of speaks to us much more today, I guess, or we are much more used to it.
All right. Thank you.